I'm here today with Rabbi Haggai Resnikoff, who is a teacher at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, the YCT Rabbinical School, where I had the privilege to study myself, and is the director of community learning at the yeshiva. And I think one of the interesting questions I want to explore with Rav Haggai today is the study of Talmud. Why should a modern person study Talmud? What does the study of the rabbinic literature have to offer us today?
Well, I guess I would say that the study of Talmud can be sort of broken into two different pieces. A person who is studying Talmud for the purpose of keeping the halakha and following the Jewish law is really going to look to the Talmud for it to be a source of inspiration and understanding the basis of real Jewish law. That is to say, Jewish law really starts in the Talmud. That's really the foundational piece. But there are plenty of people in the world who study Talmud for non-legal purposes. I think that the best reason I can think of is that really the Talmud is ours. It is the source of our wisdom. We talk about having two Torahs, two Torahs, a written Torah and an oral Torah. The written Torah is something that's quite accessible to people. It's been translated in a lot of different ways, and people really feel comfortable approaching it. The oral Torah is more difficult to access. And studying the Talmud is really the connection to the oral Torah, and across a whole variety of ways, and it gives people access to a wisdom that's not so accessible in the written Torah. It tells people what were the Jews doing at the time that Judaism was really becoming what we know it today to be today. So it tells us about what people believed. It tells us about how people engaged with one another. It also tells us about some of the bases of some of our practices that maybe aren't so rational, some of the mystical practices, or even some of the superstitious practices. The Talmud is just this amazing, rich document that contains folk medicine and law and sociology and just a whole variety of things that really the edifice of Judaism as we know it is really built on that text.
Yeah, one of the things I think of in Talmud study is the value of machloket l'shem shamayim, of disagreement for the sake of heaven. That today we live in a very polarized world, and yet the rabbis seem to have been more comfortable or more willing to allow very disparate voices to exist in one sphere. You learn the Talmud, the fact that they're quoting their opposition, they're engaging in argument, as opposed to today where there's a lot more shaming and separation in a sense. So it really is a magnificent, and I think a lot of people think that you have to be an expert in Talmud to study, but actually today Talmud can be very accessible. So what are some of the different ways, methodologies, pedagogies that people can study Talmud? I mean, of course you can just open it and just read it, but if you want to be a part of a more complicated hermeneutic, a more complicated interpretive process, what are some of the options people have, traditionally and maybe even modern time?
Well, I'll start with just what the sort of traditional way of doing it is,
right,
which is really to study. I guess there are two ways, really, to study a sugya, what we call sugya liba de hilchata. That is to say, we study the Talmud in order to begin the process of understanding the Jewish law, ultimately with the goal of understanding how we're supposed to behave. That's one way, and it's really a very kind of insular and very specific way. I'm not even sure that it's the most popular way. The way that you'd find sort of in a yeshiva context is generally a really interesting way, which is to approach the Talmud, to deliberately take parts of the Talmud that don't have a lot of practical repercussions in terms of our practice today, but things like what happens if my car hits your car and neither one of us was really at fault, but there are all kinds of aspects, but it was really on your property and I didn't have a right to be on your property. Questions of that nature, which at the end of the day, largely in the larger Jewish world, there are places where people would go to a Beit Din, a Jewish court, to sort of find out what to do in those situations. But largely we just go to court to figure out how those things work. But we take those examples and try to understand what the rabbis have to say about those situations in order to kind of create an ethos of Jewish thought in a legal context. And what that entails is both a legal sensitivity and also a logical sensitivity, because the Talmud is a text that really involves a lot of discussion of the logical connections between different parts of an argument, and in fact will sort of reflect on itself in a meta kind of way to say, oh, actually, that argument isn't even a good argument because of the following thing. And it's so lateral thinking that really you travel the whole distance. So that's sort of a traditional way of doing it. I can think of two more ways that have become popular today. The first, and both of them I should say, have been, I don't know if they were formulated in a university setting, but they are ways of thinking that fit very well in the university and are less embraced in the sort of traditional world. One is to address the Talmud as literature. The Talmud is full of stories that have a lot going on in them. Sometimes they're very complicated, difficult to understand, and sometimes they're quite straightforward until you actually start to probe and figure out what's going on in them. And so there's a whole school of thought about trying to understand each story and really figure out what's it doing, what are the ideas. One of the things that's so interesting about the Talmud is that in some places it becomes hugely verbose and you don't understand why, and then in some places it's so compact and you need to understand why that's so as well. In that way, I guess it resembles the written Torah. I'm thinking about the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, and how compact that is. So that's one. That's another way of thinking. Often in the traditional world, we sort of pushed aside the stories and sort of focused on the law. The truth is that what I was talking about before, the ethos of the Talmud and the desire to understand sort of what were the rabbis thinking, comes through much more in stories than necessarily in the legal, logical conversations that they have. The last way is the way that sort of is closest to my heart, although I would say that it now is in close rivalry with sort of the first two ways that I discussed. It's been a long time since I've sort of been in a university setting. But that is to really examine the Talmud in a critical academic way, which, for me at least, involves trying to trace the text of the Talmud itself in manuscript traditions. Today we really have very little sense that the old books that we have, books of Homer, books of the church fathers, of Augustine and those kinds of things, actually have a manuscript tradition of people who had to, the book was written and then people had to copy it by hand over and over and over again. The Talmud has a more complicated manuscript tradition even than that, because it didn't have a single author and it didn't have, appears not to have had a single editor. So the copying process is a very important and interesting process. So it begins with examining the text and trying to use rules that sort of have been come to through sort of the classical model, through scholars of Homer and things like that, to try to determine, well, what actually was the original text of the Talmud? And then from that, there's an appeal to archaeology, an appeal to study of history, say of Roman history or of Persian history, in ways that can help us to contextualize statements that are going on in the Talmud. The last piece I would say, which is quite an exciting piece, but often lacking in evidence, and so I don't know, it's not the way that I often address it, is to take the language of the Talmud itself and say, this line doesn't seem to be addressing the line before it. Maybe it's talking about something else entirely and has been totally artificially injected here. The closest thing I can think of is an article by none other than J.R.R. Tolkien about Beowulf, in which he writes, scholars go at Beowulf and they try to take out all of the Christianity, and then they try to take out all of the later injections, and then they complain that the poem doesn't work, and that it's a totally flat and uninteresting poem. And he says, no, everything has to be a part of it. My feeling is that actually by taking everything out and identifying sort of what the individual context is of particular statements, and then putting it all back together, you can actually understand why it is that a text that can be very difficult and often, especially to sort of a layman's eye, feel very kind of arbitrary and unorganized, why it is organized in that way. And I find that to be an extremely powerful experience.
Beautiful. So my last question for you is on one of the approaches you identified, the academic approach. Tell us a little bit about the sort of the history of the academic approach. How new is this? And why is this of value to us? Why would someone find it meaningful to engage in a more academic or critical approach of Talmud? And maybe lastly, are there introductory books people can read to begin to grapple with a more critical study of Talmud that you might recommend?
So I guess I'll start at the beginning.
Okay.
I'm not certain that I understand the entire length of history, but my understanding is that the story really begins. This is going to be a long conversation. The story begins with Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, in the 18th century. The Vilna Gaon came along and he looked at the way that the Talmud was being studied up until his time, and he said, we've gone off the path. We've followed a direction that is highly intellectually inspiring, but no longer actually deals with the Talmud on its own terms and in its own right. Essentially what people were doing is they were asking questions like, why didn't the Talmud ask this question instead of the question that it asked? And what would I have said if it had asked that question? Now I'm not an expert in the kind of learning that was being done before the Vilna Gaon, before Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, but he essentially came with the approach that no, what we need to do is we need to go back to the text, and instead of asking why didn't it say what it could have said, we need to ask the question of what is it trying to say in and of itself. And that led in a whole bunch of different directions as people tried to understand, well, what is the Talmud trying to say? Sort of the most interesting sort of traditional direction was the direction of the first Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, the Beit Halevi, and then his son Reb Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, who said, actually, when you really understand the Talmud, what you understand is that we're not talking about very concrete discussions about sort of how reality is understood. What we're talking about, a particular reality, say, how fast were you driving? What we're talking about is sort of a conceptual model of how things work. That when you are driving, are you responsible for the car, or is the car seen as its own a vehicle that is moving you? And those have the way you see it have differences. So that was a traditional, or what has now become the traditional method of learning. A group of people from the school of thought called Wissenschaft Judentums, what we call in Hebrew Chochmat Yisrael. At that time, we're talking about a whole group of Jewish texts. Let's just say the Bible, the non-biblical literature, books like the Book of Tobias and the Apocrypha and things like that, and then the Talmudic literature as well. And saying, we've developed all of these tools in the universities, and we can apply those tools and actually learn interesting things about these texts in that way. And so they applied it to the Talmud as well. As further advances occurred in the intellectual world of the classics and in text criticism in general, those new ideas were also developed for Jewish texts. And at a certain point, there was also a specific movement of the individual uniqueness of Jewish texts, and specifically in the Talmud. So that was, I guess, in the 19th century, those things sort of came to fruition. In the 20th century, we've had some of the great scholars of the process today who are sort of, nobody who's learning in this method can kind of move without them. The two who kind of stand out in my mind are Jacob Nachum Epstein, who was an important person in the very beginning of the Hebrew University, and then his student, Professor Saul Lieberman, who was well known at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and whose books are sort of as the best you can get in the area of study. The question of why you would want to do it is one that is close to my heart, and one that I've thought of a lot, especially since deciding not to be a professor of Talmud, but actually to become a rabbi and try to bring Judaism to people who may not have access in the same ways. For me, it gets to the question of truth. And it goes back maybe to the sort of different directions that people went from Rabbi Elijah's position, that you need to understand what the Talmud itself is saying. For me, there are a lot of different ways of saying something that is true. If I say that I am here to teach Torah, that is true. But if I say that I'm also here because you asked me to come, well, that's also true. And if I say that I'm here because the plane brought me and the cab got me here, those things are also true. And I feel like to miss out on any of them, even the banal one about how I actually physically got here, is to not really understand what's going on in the text. And it's to sort of turn away from a whole aspect of the truth. There is resistance to learning in this way, and the resistance is understandable because when you start especially to examine the textual history of a text, what you find out is that what we thought everybody was saying, that it was unanimous that something is, that everybody says yes about a particular idea, it turns out that actually some manuscripts say that people said no, or some people said maybe. And that can be very threatening when you base your entire religious system on a single or a few texts. A similar, perhaps, idea would be the feeling of threat that comes with from biblical criticism. But I myself feel that the history of the Jewish law and of the conception that we have of rabbinics is an authoritative history. And what do I mean by that? Not that there is one history that is the one that occurs, but rather that what exists now is actually authoritative on me, even though I may understand that the way it got here was quite circuitous. I don't think anybody in the Jewish world would object to the idea that rabbis in the 12th and 13th century were keeping the Jewish law and Jewish customs differently than I keep them today. And yet, I don't make the claim, and I don't agree with the claim that, well, in that case, we have the option of going back to doing what the rabbis in the 12th and 13th century were doing. And that being the case, it doesn't threaten me either to know that actually there were perhaps different opinions in the Talmud. Or, maybe an idea that I thought went all the way back to the 2nd century, maybe actually dates to the 5th century, or later, maybe even the 8th century. That doesn't change the fact that in the present, I am still, from my point of view, required to observe the standards as they've been set today. And then what that means for me is, since I'm willing to follow the trail of how things got to be the way they are, I have a much stronger sense about what's new, what's old, some things that I perhaps thought were unimportant. I could get raised in my ideas of the importance. Very few things that I already believe are important, I start to dismiss based on like, oh, well, that only became important in the last 500 years. 500 years is a long time for that to happen. So for me, ultimately, it boils down to a sense that I really want to know as much as possible about this text. I really want to know why it looks the way it looks, why it says what it says. And understanding those things can help me understand also motivations, thoughts and ideas that maybe I didn't understand. And I'll give you an example, just that's been on my mind recently. I've been recently teaching about the question of the corporeality of God. We're getting to the Torah portion on the golden calf. There seems to be a problem with saying that God is corporeal, has a body, or can be placed in one particular place and not in another place. If you follow the train back, you find that I have no doubt today that it is essentially not permitted according to the Jewish law to say that God has a body or that God can be located in any particular place. On the other hand, if I follow the ideas backwards, I can find evidence and see that there are places. There's a piece of the Talmud that I was looking at where it says, actually, God is in the West. And so that has certain repercussions about where you're going, how you're going to do certain things. So I still believe that God has no body, but it is interesting to follow that idea and say, oh, how interesting. There was a certain time when Greek philosophy coincided together with Jewish law, and there was influence in, well, not so much in both directions, but there was at least some influence, which then developed into a reasonable and perhaps, in my opinion, unyielding conclusion that really we have to believe this. That is the theology. If you go back, you can find as early as the Torah that there's certainly a theology that God is everywhere, but there are little hints in the Torah here and there that God may have a body, that God was walking in the garden, that God came down to see the tower. Those things are interesting to me, and they have to be interpreted and they have to be understood. And I'm interested in going back as far as possible to try to identify those things. It's interesting. I feel like I've gotten a little bit into the world of biblical criticism, but I feel like in Talmudic criticism, the same thing holds true, which is to say, what you really need to be looking for is how did this strange and interesting text come to be what it is? And in that way, I really get to know the writers in a way that I never knew them before. And if the writer ultimately of Torah Sheba'al Peh is God, then that also connects me to a theological imperative to really try to know this text and really try to understand as a way of getting closer to God. In terms of books that are sort of the introductions to this, I don't know that there are a lot of introductory sort of discussions of this. The one that's sort of classic, not exactly a tradition of the critical method of learning, but one that kind of gives people a real introduction to Talmud is the Essential Talmud by Adin Steinsaltz. I remember reading it when I was 13 or 14 or something and just being enwrapped. There is a book recently written in English by, I remember, one of the authors is Josh Culp, C-U-L-P. I don't remember the name of his co-author, who tried to give who write a book explaining sort of the most recent ideas about the Talmud.
We can post a link to the book on the bottom of this YouTube.
Okay, great. Aside from those books, there are lots of books written about sort of how the Talmud came to be. I think those are the two that I can think of that are.
If you think of more, we'll include those links also.
Okay, thanks.
So if you live in New York, you should certainly come to learn with Rabbi Resnikoff and the other YCT Rebbeim at the community Beit Midrash to learn Talmud. And if you're looking for an introductory approach and you don't yet live in New York, you might invest in learning Aramaic and learning Hebrew and learning the text in a rigorous way. Or in the 21st century, things have been made very accessible. If you're a Hebrew speaker, you have Rav Steinsaltz's translation.
It's coming out in English now also.
English also, and we have, of course, the Art Scroll, and these all take different approaches. And online, the truth is you can find all the Talmud translated online. If you really want to master the whole thing, or at least see out of the whole thing, there's an approach called Daf Yomi. You can learn a page a day for a little over 7 years and see the whole Torah, or you can pick little bits and really master it that way. So thank you, Rabbi Resnikoff, for shedding light. The power of Talmud study has been the staple of the Jewish people for so long, and I think you've really taken something very complex and helped us to understand some of the various facets here. All the best.
Thank you.